The crimson sky above Garak wept ash-like tears from a dying god. Warchief Thurek Ironhide stood atop the crumbling ramparts of what had once been the great citadel of Morgath, his scarred hands gripping the stone ledge until his knuckles showed white beneath the grime. Below him stretched the wasteland that had once been the fertile valleys of his people, now nothing more than scorched earth, twisted metal, and the bones of a civilization that had torn itself apart. The War of 7 Clans had raged for 3 decades. What began as a dispute over mining rights in the Northern Territories had escalated into total annihilation. Clan fought clan, brother fought brother, until the very sky turned red with the smoke of burning cities and the ground ran black with spilled oil from ruptured refineries. The great forests of Garak, which had stood for millennia, were now fields of ash. The rivers ran poison. The air itself had become a weapon. "War Chief!" came a gravelly voice behind him. Thurek turned to see Grashk, his most trusted advisor, approaching through the rubble. The old Orc's left arm hung useless at his side, a casualty of the siege of Bloodrock 3 moons prior. His tusks, once pristine white, were now stained yellow with the perpetual haze that hung over their dying world. "The Council of Survivors awaits your word." Thurek nodded grimly. The Council of Survivors, what a bitter name for what remained of his people's leadership. Where once there had been 7 great clans, each boasting thousands of warriors, now there were barely 300 orcs left alive on all of Garak. The proud Ironhide clan, which had ruled the southern provinces for generations, was down to 47 souls. The engineering genius of the Gearite clan had been reduced to 12 elderly tinkers and their apprentices. Even the mighty Bloodaxe clan, legendary for their warriors, could muster only 19 battle-capable fighters. They descended through the ruins of the citadel, past empty halls where the voices of ancestors seemed to whisper accusations from the shadows. The great throne room, where Thurek's father and grandfather had held court, was now little more than a shell. The massive ironwood throne, carved from a single tree that had taken root when Garak was young, lay in splinters beneath fallen masonry. The Council of Survivors had gathered in what had once been a storage room in the citadel's lower levels. It was one of the few spaces that still had an intact roof and walls thick enough to keep out the worst of the toxic wind. 17 orcs sat around a makeshift table constructed from salvaged metal plates. These were the last leaders of a dying race. "Brothers and sisters," Thurek began, his voice echoing off the damp stone walls. "We have called this gathering because the choice before us is simple. We can remain here and die with our world, or we can seek a new home among the stars." Crag Gearite, the eldest surviving member of the engineering clan, leaned forward. His mechanical eye whirred as it focused, a masterpiece of Orcish technology that had somehow survived when so much else had perished. "The ships, War Chief. Tell them about the ships." Thurek nodded. "For the past year, while the last of our clans were bleeding themselves dry in their final battles, a small group of engineers and laborers worked in secret. They have been cannibalizing every piece of functional technology left on Garak: starship engines, life support systems, navigation computers, hull plating. They have built us 3 vessels. Built from scraps," muttered Vorgak of the Bloodaxe clan. "Patchwork ships held together with prayers and rust." "Patchwork ships that can fly," Crag retorted, his organic eye flashing with old fire. "My apprentices have worked miracles with what little we had. The ships are not beautiful, but they are functional. Each can carry approximately 100 passengers and enough supplies for a journey of several months, assuming we can find a habitable world." Thurek spread his hands on the table. "The choice is before us. We know of several star systems within our range that our astronomers believe may harbor suitable worlds. We can divide our people among the 3 ships and seek new homes, or we can stay here and add our bones to those already littering our poisoned homeland." The debate that followed was fierce but brief. These were survivors, pragmatists who had witnessed the end of everything they had ever known. Sentiment was a luxury they could no longer afford. Within 2 hours, the decision was unanimous. They would abandon Garak and seek their fortune among the stars. The next 3 days were a frenzy of preparation. Every surviving orc on the planet was contacted through the few remaining communication networks. Families were torn apart as they decided who would go and who would stay, for there were still those too old, too sick, or too stubborn to abandon their dying world. The strongest and most capable were given priority, along with the young who represented any hope for a future. The 3 ships were a testament to Orcish ingenuity born of desperation. The largest, which Thuric named Garak's Vengeance, was built around the hull of an old cargo hauler, its sides bristling with cannibalized weapons systems and additional fuel tanks. The second, Iron Will, was sleeker, constructed from the remains of a passenger liner with upgraded engines. The smallest, Last Hope, looked like exactly what it was, a collection of spare parts welded together into something that might charitably be called a spacecraft. On the morning of departure, 314 Orcs stood in the shadow of their ramshackle fleet. Many wept openly, something that would have been unthinkable in the proud days before the war. They were leaving behind not just the world, but their entire history. The great libraries of Morgath were ash. The ancestral burial grounds were poisoned wastelands. The forges where their greatest weapons had been crafted were cold and broken. Thuric boarded Garak's Vengeance with 112 others, including most of the surviving warriors and engineers. Grash took command of Iron Will with 96 passengers, primarily the elderly and the young. The remaining 106 boarded Last Hope under the leadership of Vorgak Bloodaxe. As the 3 ships lifted off from the ruins of Garak, rising slowly through the toxic atmosphere on roaring columns of flame, Thuric stood at the main viewport and watched his homeworld shrink below them. The devastation was even more complete than he had realized from ground level. Entire continents were nothing but wasteland. The polar ice caps had melted and were frozen, stained red with chemical runoff. The great ocean of Morgal, where his people had first learned to sail, was the color of dried blood. "Where to, War Chief?" asked Mozak, the young pilot who had volunteered to guide Garak's Vengeance through the void. He was barely past his naming ceremony, but he had shown remarkable skill with the cobbled-together navigation systems. Thuric consulted the star charts they had managed to salvage from the ruins of the old observatory. 3 systems showed promise within their fuel range: Kepler 442, known to have a planet in the habitable zone but too far for detailed analysis; Wolf 1061, closer but with uncertain conditions; and a small yellow star system that their astronomers had designated as Sol 3 in their catalogs. It was the closest of the 3, requiring only a few months of travel, and spectral analysis suggested it harbored a world with water and oxygen. "Set course for Sol 3, Thuric commanded. "Signal the other ships. We go to find our new home." As the 3 vessels aligned themselves toward their distant destination and engaged their faster-than-light drives, the last survivors of Garak left their dying world behind forever. None of them looked back again. The journey through space was unlike anything in Orcish experience. For a people accustomed to the solid ground beneath their feet and the open sky above their heads, the endless void pressed against them like a living thing. The recycled air tasted of metal and fear. The constant hum of engines and life support systems became a maddening drone that invaded their dreams. Aboard Garak's Vengeance, Thuric tried to maintain the discipline and structure that had kept his people together through the worst of the wars. He instituted work shifts, training rotations, and council meetings. But the psychological toll of their situation was evident in the way conversations died when he entered a room, in the hollow stares of Orcs gazing out at the star-scattered darkness, in the fights that broke out over trivial matters. The ship's communication systems allowed the 3 vessels to maintain contact, but the reports were uniformly grim. 2 weeks into the journey, Last Hope reported critical failures in their water recycling systems. Iron Will was struggling with power fluctuations that threatened their life support. Garak's Vengeance seemed to be in the best condition, but even their ship was showing signs of strain. "These vessels were never designed for a journey of this length," Crag admitted during a private meeting with Thuric in what passed for the ship's conference room, really just a storage closet with a table bolted to the floor. "We built them to get us away from Garak. Whether they can get us all the way to our destination, that's in the hands of the ancestors now." Thuric studied the damage reports scrolling across the small display screen. "How long do we have?" If nothing else fails catastrophically, we might make it. But if we encounter any serious problems, Cragg shrugged. We're flying on borrowed time with borrowed parts. The crisis came in the 7th week of their journey. Thurok was awakened from uneasy sleep by the wailing of emergency alarms. He stumbled through the ship's narrow corridors to the command center, where Mozak was frantically working at the navigation console. What's happening? Massive system failure on Last Hope, Mozak reported, his young face pale with strain. They've lost main power and are running on emergency batteries. Life support is failing. Through the ship's communication system, Thurok could hear the chaos aboard their sister vessel. Vorgak's voice crackled through the static. Garak's vengeance, we need immediate assistance. Reactor containment is failing. We have maybe 6 hours before total system shutdown. The next few hours were a nightmare of emergency repairs conducted in the vacuum of space. Using the ship's primitive docking systems, Garak's Vengeance and Iron will manage to link up with the crippled Last Hope. Working in improvised space suits cobbled together from environmental gear, Orcish engineers and technicians performed miracles of jury-rigged repair work. But it wasn't enough. Despite their best efforts, Last Hope was dying. The reactor that powered the ship was beyond repair, cannibalizing itself in a cascade of failures that threatened to take the entire vessel with it. We have to evacuate, Vorgak reported, his warrior's pride evident in every word despite the desperate situation. All 106 souls aboard. Can your ships take them? The mathematics were brutal. Garak's Vengeance and Iron Will were already overcrowded. Adding another 100+ passengers would strain their life support systems beyond their limits. They would have to abandon precious supplies, equipment, and living space. It would be a journey of suffering for everyone involved. We take them, Thurok commanded without hesitation. All of them. We leave no one behind. The evacuation took 12 hours. One by one, the passengers and crew of Last Hope transferred to the remaining ships, carrying only what they could fit in a single bag. Weapons, tools, personal mementos, a lifetime of possessions abandoned in the cold vacuum of space. Families were separated as they were distributed between the 2 remaining vessels based on where space could be found. Vorgak was among the last to leave his ship. The proud warrior stood at the airlock, looking back at the vessel that had carried his people so far from home. She wasn't much to look at, he said quietly, but she was ours. They left Last Hope drifting in the void, its emergency beacon still transmitting a forlorn signal to empty space. The ship's reactor would eventually contain its failures and go cold, leaving the vessel to drift between the stars as a tomb for the dreams of the last free Orcs. The remaining weeks of the journey were a test of endurance that pushed the survivors to their limits. The ships were desperately overcrowded. Food was rationed to survival levels. Arguments and fights broke out regularly in the cramped conditions. Several elderly Orcs died during the journey, their bodies committed to space with ceremonies that seemed hollow in the endless dark. But gradually, impossibly, their destination began to grow from a point of light to an actual star. The Sol system opened before them like a flower, revealing a collection of worlds that defied easy categorization. Gas giants with dozens of moons, small rocky worlds baked by solar radiation, and, orbiting at exactly the right distance from the yellow star, a blue-green jewel that made hardened warriors weep with longing. Water, breathed Mozak as the first detailed scans came in. Massive oceans. Continents covered in green, vegetation of some kind. An oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere. It's perfect. Thurok studied the data flowing across their screens. After months of traveling through the sterile void, the idea of a living world seemed almost too good to be true. Any signs of intelligent life? The ship's sensors, cobbled together from salvaged military equipment, were not sophisticated enough for detailed analysis. But what they could detect was encouraging. No evidence of large-scale industrial activity, no massive cities visible from orbit, no defensive installations or orbital structures. It appears to be uninhabited, Cragg reported. Or at least, if there is intelligent life, it's not technologically advanced. The 2 remaining ships entered orbit around the 3rd planet from the Sun, maintaining a cautious distance while they conducted more detailed surveys. What they found was a world that seemed almost designed for their needs: vast continents with varied climates, enormous forests, mountain ranges rich in mineral deposits, and weather patterns that suggested a stable, life-supporting environment. "There," Thurok announced, pointing to a continent on the planet's northern hemisphere. "We'll establish our colony there. That large landmass has everything we need: forests for construction materials, mountains for mining, rivers for water and transportation." The decision to land was made quickly. After so long in the cramped confines of their makeshift ships, the promise of solid ground and open air was irresistible. The two vessels began their descent toward the planet's surface, choosing a landing site near what appeared to be a river valley in a temperate region of the northern continent. Garak's Vengeance touched down first, its improvised landing systems barely managing to bring the overcrowded vessel to Earth without catastrophic failure. The ship settled into the alien soil with a groan of stressed metal and the hiss of cooling engines. Through the viewports, the survivors could see their new world for the first time: rolling hills covered in strange vegetation, a sky of impossible blue, an air that shimmered with possibilities. Ironwell landed a few minutes later, coming to rest about a kilometer away from the first ship. As the roar of engines faded and the inevitable silence of a dead spacecraft settled over them, 214 Orcs prepared to set foot on an alien world that they hoped would become their new home. Thurok was the first to activate the airlock and step outside. The gravity was slightly lighter than Garak's, making him feel almost buoyant. The air was clean and sweet, free of the chemical taint that had poisoned their homeworld. In the distance, he could hear the sound of running water and the rustle of wind through vegetation. "Breathable," he called back to the others. "Clean. It's beautiful." One by one, the survivors of Garak emerged from their metal cocoons and set foot on Earth. Many fell to their knees and kissed the ground, overcome with relief and gratitude. Others simply stood and stared at the alien landscape, trying to process the reality of their situation. They had found their new home. Now they had to claim it. The Orcs had been on Earth for exactly 17 days when they encountered their first humans. In those 17 days, they had accomplished miracles of survival and adaptation. Using salvaged materials from their ships and resources gathered from the surrounding area, they had constructed a rudimentary settlement in the river valley. The engineering genius of the Girite clan had been put to immediate use, designing shelters that could be built quickly with limited tools, water purification systems that could process the local river water, and basic manufacturing equipment for producing essential tools and weapons. The location they had chosen proved to be ideal in many ways. The river provided fresh water and transportation. The surrounding forests offered abundant timber for construction and fuel. The soil was rich and appeared suitable for agriculture, though it would take time to adapt their few remaining seed stocks to the alien environment. Most importantly, they had seen no signs of intelligent life in their initial surveys of the area. Thurok stood atop a hastily constructed watchtower, surveying the growing settlement below. What had started as a desperate huddle of refugees around two dying spacecraft was beginning to look like the foundation of a real colony. Smoke rose from cooking fires and workshops. The sound of construction echoed across the valley as Orcs worked to build permanent shelters before the weather turned. Children, the precious few who had survived the journey, played in the clean air and sunlight for the first time in their lives. "War Chief!" called Grasht from below. Despite the loss of his arm, the old advisor had thrown himself into the work of organizing their new society with characteristic determination. "The scouting parties have returned." Thurok climbed down from the watchtower to where 3 Orcs waited with travel packs and weapons. They had been exploring the surrounding territory, mapping the local geography and searching for resources and potential threats. "Report," Thurok commanded. Gorth, a young warrior from the Blood Axe clan, stepped forward. His face was troubled. "War Chief, we found structures. Artificial constructions, perhaps 15 kilometers to the south." "What kind of structures?" "Dwellings, we think. But they are strange. Built from materials we don't recognize, in architectural styles unlike anything from Garak. They appear to be abandoned, but recently." We found signs of cultivation, crops growing in organized fields, though we don't recognize the plant species. Thurek frowned. This was the first evidence they had discovered of intelligent life on their new world. Any signs of the inhabitants? No direct contact, but we found tracks. Bipedal, roughly our size but different proportions. And Gorth hesitated. We found this. He held out a small object that made several orcs step back in alarm. It was clearly a weapon of some kind, though its design was completely alien. Metal and some kind of dark composite material, with a trigger mechanism and a barrel that suggested it fired projectiles. But the engineering was unlike anything in Orcish experience, sleek, precise, and obviously manufactured rather than hand-forged. Crag took the weapon and examined it with his engineer's eye. Fascinating. The metallurgy is quite advanced, though the design principles are completely different from our own. This suggests a technological civilization, though one that has developed along different lines than ours. The question, Thurek said grimly, is where are they now, and why did they leave these weapons behind? The answer came 3 days later. Thurek was in the settlement's central command post, a reinforced shelter built around the communication equipment salvaged from Garak's vengeance, when the alarm horn sounded. He rushed outside to see orcs running toward the settlement's defensive perimeter, weapons in hand. What's happening? He called to Vorgak, who was organizing the defensive response. Contact, the warrior replied grimly. Unknown beings approaching from the south. Mozak spotted them from the watchtower, bipedal, possibly the same species that left those structures. They're armed. Thurek grabbed his own weapon, a massive two-handed axe that had belonged to his father, and ran toward the southern edge of the settlement. What he saw there made him stop short. A group of perhaps 20 creatures was approaching across the open ground beyond the settlement. They were indeed bipedal, roughly the same height as orcs but with completely different proportions. Where orcs were broad and heavily muscled, these beings were slender, almost fragile-looking. Their skin was pale, their hair varied in color from yellow to brown to black. They carried weapons that appeared similar to the one Gorth had found, and they moved with the cautious coordination of experienced soldiers. But it was their faces that struck Thurek most forcefully. They were expressions of shock, fear, and confusion that transcended species barriers. These beings had clearly not expected to find anyone here, and they were as surprised by the contact as the orcs were. The two groups faced each other across 50 meters of open ground, weapons ready but not yet aimed, each waiting for the other to make the first move. The tension was so thick it seemed to press against Thurek's skin like humidity. One of the human beings, for that was clearly what they were, though Thurek had no name for them yet, stepped forward. It appeared to be their leader, distinguished by different colored markings on its clothing and the way the others deferred to it. The being raised one hand in what might have been a gesture of greeting or peaceful intent. Thurek made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He stepped forward as well, lowering his axe to a non-threatening position. I am Thurek Ironhide, war chief of the United Clans of Garak. He called out in the common tongue of his people, knowing the alien beings couldn't understand him, but hoping his tone would convey peaceful intentions. The human leader responded in its own language, equally incomprehensible but with a similar tone of cautious diplomacy. For several long moments, the two leaders tried to communicate across the barrier of language and species, using gestures and facial expressions to convey basic concepts. It might have worked. The initial contact was tense but not hostile, both sides clearly interested in avoiding violence if possible. The humans seemed as curious about the orcs as the orcs were about them. Several of the human soldiers lowered their weapons, and Thurek began to hope that first contact might proceed peacefully. Then someone fired a shot. To this day, no one knows who fired first or why. It might have been a nervous human soldier startled by an orc's sudden movement. It might have been a young orc warrior whose fingers slipped on his weapon's trigger. It might have been a deliberate act by someone on either side who wanted to sabotage any chance of peaceful coexistence. What matters is that the shot was fired, and in the space of 3 seconds, the first contact between orcs and humans dissolved into chaos. The human projectile weapons made sharp cracking sounds completely unlike the deep roar of Orcish firearms. Their bullets moved faster than anything the Orcs had experienced, striking with devastating precision. 3 Orcs fell in the first exchange of fire, their bodies torn by impacts that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But Orcs were warriors born and bred. They had survived the apocalyptic wars that destroyed their homeworld, and they were not about to be intimidated by alien weapons. Thurik's roar of rage and command echoed across the battlefield as his people responded to the attack with the fury of the desperate. Orcish weapons were crude by human standards but devastatingly effective. The heavy slug throwers that had been designed to punch through armor plating sent human soldiers flying when they struck. The combat axes and war hammers that Orcs favored in close combat could cleave through the humans' light armor as if it were paper. The battle lasted only minutes, but when the gunfire finally stopped, 8 humans and 5 Orcs lay dead in the grass between the 2 groups. The surviving humans retreated in good order, dragging their wounded with them, while the Orcs held their defensive positions and tended to their own casualties. Thurik knelt beside Gorth, the young scout who had discovered the first human settlement. The warrior was still alive but badly wounded, a human bullet having torn through his chest just below the shoulder. His breathing was labored, and blood frothed on his lips. "War Chief," Gorth whispered, his voice barely audible. They fight well. But they're not like us. Did you see their faces? They were afraid." "Rest, warrior," Thurik replied, but he knew what Gorth meant. In the brief moments before violence erupted, he had seen something in the human leader's eyes that reminded him uncomfortably of himself, the look of someone trying to protect his people in an uncertain world. But that moment of potential understanding was gone now, destroyed by gunfire and bloodshed. As he looked around at the bodies scattered across the battlefield, human and orc alike, Thurik realized that his people's long journey to find a new home was far from over. The war for Earth had begun. The news of the battle spread through both communities like wildfire, but the reactions could not have been more different. In the Orcish settlement, the survivors gathered around their dead with a mixture of grief, anger, and grim determination. The 5 fallen warriors were honored according to the old traditions, their weapons placed beside them, their names spoken by their clan brothers, their deeds recounted so that their spirits might find their way to the halls of their ancestors. But there was an added bitterness to these rites, for these Orcs had died not in the great wars of Galactic, but in a strange land fighting an unknown enemy. "They will return," Vorgak declared as the burial ceremonies concluded. "And they will bring more of their kind. We must be ready." Thurik nodded grimly. The human weapons had been impressive in their precision and rate of fire, but more concerning was the implication of their existence. The humans had military organization, manufactured weapons, and coordinated tactics. This suggested a technological civilization with significant resources, exactly the kind of opposition that could threaten the Orcs' desperate attempt to establish a new home. "How many of them are there?" asked Grashk. "If this was a scouting party, what size force are they scouting for?" It was the question that haunted all of them. The Orcs numbered barely more than 200, including the elderly and the young. They had limited ammunition for their weapons, no industrial capacity to speak of, and their only shelter was a hastily constructed settlement built from salvaged materials. If the humans possessed a large organized military, the Orc colony could be overwhelmed in a matter of days. "We need information," Thurik decided. "And we need it quickly. Gorth's scouting party found human settlements to the south. We need to know how many there are, how they're organized, and what kind of threat they represent." Meanwhile, 40 kilometers south of the Orcish settlement, the human response was unfolding in a very different manner. Captain James Harrison of the United States Army stood in the command tent of Forward Operating Base Alpha, staring at the photographs spread across the tactical table. The images, taken by drones that had overflown the alien settlement, showed a scene that defied easy categorization. "Initial count indicates approximately 200 individuals," reported Lieutenant Sarah Chin, the intelligence officer who had been analyzing the reconnaissance data. "They appear to be living in temporary structures built around what look like crashed spacecraft." The architecture and technology are completely unknown, but clearly advanced in some respects. General Patricia Williams, the officer commanding the emergency response to what the media were already calling First Contact, studied the images with the eye of a career soldier. "These aren't little green men in flying saucers," she observed. "Look at the size of them. Look at the weapons they're carrying. These are warriors." The photographs told a disturbing story. The beings in the alien settlement were large, heavily built, and clearly organized along military lines. Their weapons appeared primitive compared to human technology, but were obviously functional and lethal. More concerning was the evidence of rapid construction and adaptation. In less than 3 weeks, the aliens had built what appeared to be a fortified settlement complete with defensive positions and organized infrastructure. "What do we know about their intentions?" General Williams asked. Captain Harrison, who had led the patrol that made first contact, shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, the initial encounter was ambiguous. They seemed surprised to see us, and their leader attempted some form of communication. I got the impression they might have been willing to talk, but then someone opened fire and all attempts at diplomacy went out the window." "Someone on which side?" "Unknown, ma'am. The situation deteriorated too quickly to determine who fired first." General Williams studied the tactical situation map that covered one wall of the command tent. The alien settlement was positioned in an ideal defensive location: river access, high ground, dense forest for cover. Whoever their military commanders were, they understood basic strategic principles. "What are our options?" she asked her staff. Colonel David Martinez, the base's senior tactical officer, pointed to the map. "Direct assault would be costly and might not be successful. The terrain favors the defender, and we don't know the full extent of their capabilities. A siege might be more effective, but it would take time and resources we might not have. Diplomatic contact? Difficult after the initial incident. Both sides have taken casualties. There's likely to be a desire for revenge on both sides." General Williams made the decision that would shape everything that followed. "We can't allow a potentially hostile alien force to establish a permanent foothold on American soil. If diplomacy isn't an option, then we'll have to consider this a military problem. Begin preparations for a comprehensive response operation." The escalation that followed was rapid and tragic in its inevitability. Over the next week, both sides prepared for war. The humans moved additional forces into the area, including heavy equipment, air support, and specialized units trained in irregular warfare. Satellite surveillance and drone overflights provided detailed intelligence on the Orcish settlement, mapping defensive positions and identifying potential targets. The Orcs, meanwhile, had their own intelligence-gathering operations underway. Using their superior knowledge of fieldcraft and camouflage, Orcish scouts penetrated deep into human territory, conducting reconnaissance on military installations and civilian settlements. What they found was both encouraging and terrifying. "They have great numbers," reported Vargul, one of the few Orcs with formal military intelligence training from the old wars on Galactic. "Their nearest large settlement contains perhaps 50,000 individuals, with smaller communities scattered throughout the region. But they appear to be soft. Many of their people have no warrior training, and their soldiers rely heavily on their weapons rather than personal combat skills. And their military capabilities? Significant. They have flying vehicles that can attack from great distances, armored ground vehicles, and weapons that fire projectiles with great accuracy and speed. But their tactics are rigid, dependent on complex supply lines and communication systems. They fight like a people who have never faced true desperation." Thurok absorbed this information with growing concern. The humans had advantages in numbers and technology, but the Orcs had advantages in individual combat capability and the desperate motivation of people with nowhere to retreat. It would be an ugly war, and there could be only one winner. The first major engagement came when a human patrol stumbled across an Orcish hunting party in the forest south of the settlement. The Orcs had been tracking a large animal, something like a deer but larger, when they were spotted by a human drone. Within minutes, attack helicopters were inbound, and the forest erupted in violence. The battle was brief but vicious. The human helicopters strafed the forest with automatic weapons fire, forcing the orcs to take cover among the trees. But orcs had been hunting in forests for thousands of years, and they knew how to use terrain to their advantage. Grath, a Blood Axe clan warrior, managed to climb a tall tree and leap onto one of the hovering aircraft, his combat axe biting deep into the vehicle's rotor assembly. The helicopter crashed in a spectacular fireball that could be seen from both settlements. By the time ground forces arrived to investigate, the orcs had vanished back into the forest, taking their wounded with them and leaving behind only the wreckage of the downed aircraft and the bodies of its crew. The news of the helicopter's destruction sent shockwaves through the human command structure. These aliens weren't just primitive refugees. They were capable of sophisticated military operations against modern equipment. This changes the tactical picture completely, Colonel Martinez briefed General Williams the next morning. If they can bring down our aircraft with primitive weapons and guerrilla tactics, then this is going to be a much more difficult operation than we anticipated. Recommendations? We need to accelerate our timeline. The longer we allow them to establish defensive positions and learn our capabilities, the more difficult it will be to dislodge them. I recommend a full-scale assault within 72 hours. General Williams stared at the tactical displays showing the alien settlement. 200 beings who had traveled across the vast darkness between stars, only to find themselves at war with the inhabitants of the world they had hoped would be their new home. It was tragic in its way, but she had her orders and her responsibilities to the American people. Approved. Begin Operation Homecoming immediately. As both sides prepared for the largest battle yet in the escalating war, neither humans nor orcs fully understood what they were unleashing. This would not be a simple conflict between primitive aliens and modern military forces. This would be a clash between two warrior cultures, each fighting for what they believed was their very survival. The battle for Earth was about to begin in earnest. Operation Homecoming began at dawn on a Tuesday morning that dawned clear and cold. General Williams had assembled a force of over 800 soldiers, supported by tanks, artillery, attack helicopters, and fighter aircraft. It was a textbook example of combined arms warfare, designed to overwhelm the alien settlement through superior firepower and coordination. The humans had learned from their previous encounters with the orcs. Instead of a direct frontal assault, they planned a coordinated attack from multiple directions, using their mobility and technological advantages to prevent the aliens from concentrating their defenses. Artillery would soften the target area, airstrikes would neutralize key defensive positions, and then ground forces would move in to secure the settlement and capture or eliminate any surviving aliens. But the orcs had been learning too. Thurek stood in the command bunker that had been dug beneath the settlement's central area, studying the tactical display that Crag had cobbled together from salvaged sensors and communication equipment. Red symbols marked the positions of approaching human forces, more than the Orcish scouts had ever detected in one place before. They mean to end this quickly, Grashk observed. The old advisor had insisted on remaining in the command post despite his injuries, claiming that his experience from the wars on Garak was too valuable to waste in the field. Good, Thurek replied grimly. A quick end suits us as well. We cannot sustain a long campaign against their numbers. The Orcish defense plan was built around the harsh realities of their situation. They were outnumbered 4-1, outgunned by superior technology, and had no possibility of retreat or reinforcement. Their only advantages were their individual combat skills, their knowledge of the local terrain, and their absolute desperation. They would make the humans pay such a terrible price for victory that even winning would feel like defeat. The settlement itself had been transformed over the past weeks into a fortress that would have impressed the military engineers of Garak. Every building was a potential strongpoint, connected to its neighbors by underground tunnels and trenches. Weapons emplacements had been dug into the hillsides, camouflaged so thoroughly that they were invisible until they opened fire. The river had been diverted and dammed to create a series of water obstacles that would channel attacking forces into predetermined kill zones. Most importantly, the orcs had prepared for the loss of their settlement. Hidden caches of weapons and supplies had been buried throughout the surrounding forest. Escape routes had been mapped and rehearsed. If the settlement fell, and everyone expected it would, eventually, the survivors would melt into the wilderness and continue fighting as guerrillas. Remember, Thuric addressed his assembled warriors, we are not fighting for this place. We are fighting for time, and for respect. Every human we kill here is one fewer that will hunt our children. Every minute we hold them costs them resources they cannot easily replace. Make them remember that orcs do not die easily. The battle began with a thunderous artillery barrage that shook the earth for kilometers in every direction. Human 155mm howitzers, firing from positions more than 20 kilometers away, dropped high explosive shells with precision guided by drone spotters and satellite imagery. The barrage lasted for 30 minutes, long enough to reduce most conventional defensive positions to rubble. But the orcs had expected this. The surface structures of their settlement had been built to look substantial, while actually being largely empty shells. The real defensive positions were underground, reinforced with steel plating salvaged from their ships and designed to survive exactly this kind of bombardment. When the artillery fire lifted, human attack helicopters swept in low and fast, their sensors scanning for targets among the smoke and debris. They found what appeared to be a settlement in ruins, with only scattered signs of life among the wreckage. That was when the orcs sprang their first trap. The anti-aircraft weapons that rose from concealed positions among the rubble were unlike anything in human experience. Massive crossbow-like devices that fired harpoons trailing steel cables, they were designed to bring down the flying machines that had terrorized the battlefields of Galactic. The first helicopter to fall was dragged out of the sky by cables that wrapped around its rotors, sending it crashing into the riverbank in a ball of flame. But the humans adapted quickly. The surviving helicopters pulled back to safer distances and began systematically destroying every position that revealed itself by firing. Their missiles and cannon fire were devastatingly accurate, and within minutes several of the Orcish anti-aircraft emplacements had been reduced to scrap metal. The ground assault began from 3 directions simultaneously. M1 Abrams tanks led the advance, their thick armor shrugging off the Orcish weapons that had been so effective against lighter vehicles. Behind them came infantry fighting vehicles and dismounted soldiers, advancing with the methodical precision of a well-trained military force. For the first hour, Operation Homecoming proceeded exactly as planned. Human forces systematically cleared the outer perimeter of the settlement, destroying defensive positions and eliminating any aliens that offered resistance. Casualties were light on the human side, with only a few soldiers wounded by the orcs' primitive but effective weapons. Then the humans reached the inner defensive line, and the real battle began. The orcs who emerged from the underground tunnels and bunkers were unlike anything human soldiers had encountered before. Standing nearly 7 feet tall and weighing over 300 pounds each, they were living weapons forged by generations of warfare. Their armor, crafted from the steel plating of their spaceships, could turn aside small arms fire. Their weapons, while technologically primitive, were devastatingly effective in close combat. Vorgak Bloodaxe led the first counterattack, emerging from a tunnel directly beneath a group of advancing human soldiers. His war hammer, a massive 2-handed weapon that had been forged in the great armories of Galactic, crushed through body armor and bones with equal ease. Behind him came a dozen other orc warriors, their battle cries echoing across the battlefield as they charged into hand-to-hand combat. The human soldiers, trained for modern warfare with its emphasis on firepower and technology, were unprepared for the brutal reality of close-quarters combat against opponents who had spent their entire lives learning to kill with hand weapons. In the space of minutes, an entire squad was overrun and eliminated. But the humans had advantages of their own. Radio communication allowed them to coordinate their responses instantly. When one unit was attacked, supporting forces could redirect their fire within seconds. The orcs' superior individual combat abilities were offset by the humans' superior organization and firepower. The battle raged for hours, flowing back and forth across the settlement like a tide of violence. Buildings changed hands multiple times as human forces advanced and Orcish counterattacks drove them back. The air filled with smoke and the sound of gunfire, punctuated by the deeper roar of tank cannons and the screech of incoming artillery shells. Thuric fought beside his warriors, his ancestral battle-axe cleaving through human weapons and armor alike. At his side, Crag wielded a weapon of his own devising, a combination warhammer and explosive device that could breach the humans' armored vehicles. Together, they led charge after charge against the advancing enemy, each attack designed to inflict maximum casualties regardless of cost. But slowly, inexorably, the human advantages began to tell. For every orc warrior who fell, 2 or 3 humans died, but the humans had hundreds more soldiers to call upon, while every Orcish casualty was irreplaceable. The settlement's defensive positions were systematically destroyed by human firepower. The underground tunnel system was collapsed by explosive charges. The river ran red with blood from both species. By late afternoon, the battle was clearly lost. The Orcs held only a few strongpoints in the center of the settlement, and these were under constant attack from all sides. Ammunition was running low. The wounded were dying for lack of medical supplies. The survivors faced the choice between surrender and annihilation. "War Chief," Grash called from his position at the communication station. "It's time. Signal the withdrawal." Thurek looked around the command bunker at the handful of orcs who remained. These were the last free representatives of their species, survivors of the great wars of Garak, refugees who had crossed the void between stars seeking a new home, warriors who had fought with courage and honor against impossible odds. "Sound the retreat," he commanded. "Execute Dispersal Plan Omega." The signal went out on all frequencies, transmitted in the ancient battle code of the Orcish clans. Across the battlefield, the surviving orcs began to implement their final strategy. Instead of fighting to the death in hopeless defensive positions, they would scatter into the wilderness like seeds on the wind. Some would die in the attempt, but others would survive to continue the struggle from the forests and mountains. As human forces converged on the central stronghold for the final assault, they found it mysteriously quiet. When they finally breached the walls and cleared the underground bunkers, they discovered only empty rooms and cold ashes. The aliens had vanished as if they had never existed, leaving behind only their dead and the smoldering ruins of humanity's first contact with another intelligent species. The battle of the settlement was over. The humans had won a complete tactical victory, destroying the alien colony and driving the survivors into the wilderness. But as General Williams surveyed the smoking ruins and counted the cost, over 200 human casualties, including some of the army's best soldiers, she couldn't shake the feeling that the war itself was far from finished. In the forests beyond the battlefield, small groups of orcs melted into the darkness, carrying their wounded and their hatred with them. The settlement was lost, but the orcs themselves survived. And as long as they survived, they would continue to fight for the right to exist on the world they had claimed as their new home. The guerrilla war was about to begin.